What's up, music lovers? Thank you for clicking on my channel, and I'm super excited about today's video because today I'm finally going to have a chance to talk about and rank every single album from one of my all-time favorite bands, Judas Priest. And before we go ahead, if you like hard rock, heavy metal, progressive rock, any kind of guitar-driven music, please feel free to go ahead and subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, all that YouTube stuff. I know it's a cliche, but it really does help the channel grow, so thank you in advance for that. I really appreciate it. And Judas Priest is not just one of the most important bands in metal, but one of the most important bands in rock in general. Glenn Tipton is one of my all-time favorite guitar players. Rob Halford is, of course, the metal god. I can just go on and on and on about how much I respect and admire this band. And they've always brought us something a little bit different with each album. They've always adapted to the scene in music going on around them, and they've always grown and progressed. And re-listening to all these albums, I was amazed that Judas Priest at their worst really isn't that bad. Maybe the album is just a little bit forgettable. I mean, this is a really solid lineup of albums, so I'm sure that I'm going to say stuff that you disagree with, and that's completely fine. There's probably about 150,000 different ways you could rank these albums, so if you disagree with me, please let me know. I want to hear your opinion on what your favorite Judas Priest albums are. I want to hear if you agree or disagree with some of the points I make, but just don't be a dick about it, okay? Most of you are super cool, but, this is the internet, so I have to put out that disclaimer. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Coming in with their debut album from 1974, Rock-a-Roller. I'm going to go ahead and put this down in C tier. This is definitely one of the more boring Judas Priest albums. It's a fine debut for the time, but there's nothing about it that is super unique or something that really is like very bold, with the exception of the song Run of the Mill. I think that the lyrics for that song are incredible, and that Rob Halford's vocal performance on Run of the Mill is really showcasing how good of a singer he is, and the lyrical themes on that song kind of hint at where Rob would go as a lyricist in the 70s with some of my favorite albums. So Run of the Mill, S tier Judas Priest song. Other than that, like, Never Satisfied is fine. The title track is fine. But there's nothing really that just shines of confidence, and everything that Judas Priest did on this album, they do better, I feel like, on subsequent albums. And I think, too, that there's a bit of an identity crisis because Glenn and Rob joined the band shortly before this album was put out. I think most of the songs had already been written, and then Al Atkins, the previous singer, and maybe some band members had come and gone. The songs on this album are all written by a bunch of different people who are not even in the same band at the same time. So with that being considered, I think it's a pretty solid first album when you consider what's going on around it, but far from their best, and far from an album that really has a solid, unique sound. But Judas Priest would make up for that with their second album, 1976, Sad Wings of Destiny. And this is not just one of my favorite Judas Priest albums, it's one of my favorite albums of all time. So it's going straight up in S tier for me. Just 9 songs, and they are all incredible. I love how they're kind of foreshadowing where metal would go. And on this album, you can find hints of power metal, hints of thrash metal, hints of progressive metal at times. It still has like this psychedelic vibe, but it's also really heavy and fast with songs like Tyrant. I love that Rob Halford is just going all out with his love of Queen and having vocal harmony just tossed in over top. The band sounds way more confident in the studio than they do on their debut. They're doing a lot more studio tricks that give the album a really nice vibe. I love the way that Epitaph leads into Island of Domination, and Rob Halford has this gritty soul, sort of raspy quality on his voice on Island of Domination. Something he did a few times on the early albums that he kind of stepped away from doing, but I really like it. Dreamer Deceiver, probably my all-time favorite Judas Priest song. Tyrant's incredible. Victim of Change is the Ripper. This album just has a really special place in my heart. It's one of their best. Amazing artwork, too. My only gripe or nitpick about the album is that I've always felt like the guitar tone wasn't quite as good as the songs around it, but it's a very minor nitpick, so Sad Wings of Destiny is up in S tier. I absolutely love it. Okay, and coming up next is 1977's Sin After Sin, and I'm putting this up right in A tier for me. In a lot of ways, you could argue and say that Sin After Sin is better than Sad Wings of Destiny, and that the band kind of trim some of the fat and they're able to just be more concise. And if you say that Sin After Sin is your favorite Judas Priest album, I totally get it. Just like with Sad Wings of Destiny, there's not a bad song on this album, and I think that up until this point in heavy metal, it was probably the heaviest that the genre had gone. I mean, Dissident Aggressor is still mind-blowingly heavy and aggressive, and Rob Halford's vocal performance, the chugging, punishing riffs. I mean, we're listening to it 45, almost 50 years after it was put out, and it's still really heavy. I cannot imagine how insane that must have been to hear back in 1977 for the first time, and I'm really envious of anyone who got to do that. I also love Let Us Pray, Call for the Priest. Sinner is a good opener. There's nothing bad I can say about this album, and if it's your favorite, I get it. But for me, I got into the album a little bit later in my relationship with Judas Priest, so it just doesn't have that same special significance that maybe like Sad Wings of Destiny does, but it's still absolutely incredible. And coming up next is Stained Class. Just like with Sad Wings of Destiny, this is one of my all-time favorite albums, so I'm putting it up in S tier. Maybe I'll put it right above Sad Wings of Destiny. This is an album that has had such a big impact on me as a musician, a guitarist, a singer, a lyricist. I think that this album has Rob Halford's best lyrics. When you listen to songs like Stained Class, Beyond the Realms of Death, Savage, Hero's End, even like Saints in Hell, this album has really cool themes of questioning whether or not human civilization is a net positive. Maybe we lost something pure and innocent that we had before, but now that we've gone down this path of industrialization and having a society, maybe we've lost something, and that we're kind of just destroying the world and ourselves. The riffs are super heavy. Up until this point, I think Stained Class has the best Judas Priest guitar tone, and I also think Les Binks kills it on this album on the drums. This album is just one of my favorites. I love this album. All-time favorite for me. And I can't sing its praises enough. Maybe not the most accessible Judas Priest album, but for my taste, it's up in S tier. Okay, and coming up next is Hellbent for Leather or Killing Machine, depending on what part of the world you're in. And I'm gonna put it up in A tier, and I'm gonna put it right ahead of Sin After Sin, just because Sin After Sin has 8 songs, Hellbent for Leather has 11, so 8 songs that are all perfect, 11 songs that are all perfect. This album is really interesting because it's probably the only Judas Priest album that I would describe as sexy. Sexy is not a word that first comes to mind when I hear Judas Priest, and honestly, it's not an adjective I use a lot when describing heavy metal. But when you listen to songs like Delivering the Goods, Evil Fantasies, and especially Burnin' Up, which is such an underrated, overlooked, amazing Judas Priest song. I mean, how else do you describe it other than sexy and swaggering? At times, this album is almost sort of like Judas Priest does their version of Led Zeppelin, but because it's Judas Priest, there's a lot more leather and studs, and it's a bit more aggressive than Led Zeppelin. The twin lead guitar in this album is also kind of stepping it up from the previous albums with songs like Rock Forever. All in all, this album is just incredible, and just like with Sin After Sin, if it's your favorite Judas Priest album, I totally get it. They managed to hint at a more pop-oriented direction without losing their heaviness, still holding on to their sort of 1970s experimental, proggy vibe, and still having a darkness to them, which, with songs like Killing Machine, the lyrics are pretty bleak, and even songs that are sexy like Evil Fantasies, they're not holding back from being metal. So, Hellbent for Leather / Killing Machine, another amazing, incredible album, and up until this point, as you might have been able to tell, 1970s Judas Priest is probably my favorite era of the band. It just really unique, and I love the experimentation they had on these 4 albums. And coming up next is the first album I ever heard by Judas Priest, 1980's British Steel. And I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I'm going to put it in B tier. I still love this album. This is still a super important, influential album. I think it's a great introduction to the band. I do think it's really impressive how Judas Priest still held on to their heaviness with songs like Rapid Fire. The Rage is maybe the last little glimmers of that 1970s progressive Judas Priest. You Don't Have to Be Old to Be Wise is one of my favorite Judas Priest songs. But with that being said, I like the experimentation on these albums more so than I like the sort of more clean-cut sound on British Steel. So I don't want you to think for a second that me putting it down in B tier means I dislike it. It's a great introduction. It's kind of like Moving Pictures for Rush. I'm sure Tom Sawyer is the first Rush song a lot of people hear, but that doesn't mean that if you become a super big Rush fan that Tom Sawyer is your favorite Rush song. So that's kind of how I feel about British Steel. Even though I'll always love it, and I'm so grateful that I heard it because it's the first album I ever heard by them, and it's probably the first album a lot of people ever heard by them, I just prefer these albums over it. And then we get to Point of Entry, which might also be a lot of people's first introduction to Judas Priest, with the song Heading Out to the Highway, released in 1981. And I'm going to put it down in C-, above their debut for sure, but still, I think this is one of the more forgettable Judas Priest albums, unfortunately. With that being said, Heading Out to the Highway, Hot Rockin', and Desert Plains are all incredible songs that are up in S tier as far as Judas Priest songs go. And I even really like Solar Angels, and there's aspects of this album that I can enjoy, but honestly it feels as though they were a bit burned out at this point. Think about how much creative energy it takes to put out all these albums over the course of like 5 years. Well, maybe 6 if you include that 6 or 7 years, but it's a lot of work, and you can't bat 100 every single time. Both KK Downing and Rob Halford mentioned in their autobiographies that they weren't really happy with this album when it came out. And again, not terrible, but far from their best. But that's okay, because in 1982, Judas Priest released one of the greatest albums in heavy metal history, which I'm going to just put straight up in the top of A tier. Screaming for Vengeance is an absolute masterpiece. I'll just mention the 2 songs that I don't care much for on this album, and that's Take These Chains and Pain and Pleasure, because every single other song on this album is a 10 out of 10. Riding on the Wind, Electric Eye, the title track, even You Got Another Thing Coming, which is clearly following the blueprint laid down by songs like Living After Midnight and Heading Out to the Highway. They kind of wanted to have a more radio-friendly song. It's still really heavy, and Glenn Tipton's guitar solo on that song is unbelievable. He is such an amazing guitar player. His phrasing is just one of a kind. Devil's Child is also another really heavy way to end the album, with some of Rob Halford's highest notes he hits. And I love the song Fever. That's a song that I don't feel like is ever really mentioned when people talk about how good Screaming for Vengeance is, but Fever is an absolute banger. Up until this point, it has the best guitar tone out of any Judas Priest album, in my opinion. And the only reason it's not up in S tier for me is because, as amazing and incredible as it is, it just, for some reason, Stained Class and Sad Wings of Destiny hold a special place in my heart. Just like with Hellbent for Leather and Sin After Sin, if this is your favorite Judas Priest album, I completely get it, and I'm not going to argue against it. In 1984, Judas Priest released Defenders of the Faith, and I'm going to put it right next to Screaming for Vengeance, up in A tier. If somebody who had never listened to heavy metal asked me, hey Michael, why is heavy metal the greatest form of music in the history of mankind? What song should I listen to just kind of understand what this music is all about? Without a doubt, I would say go listen to Freewheel Burning, because Freewheel Burning is just heavy metal personified. Well, not personified, it's in a song. But what I mean by that is that Freewheel Burning just encapsulates so many things that make heavy metal so good in just 4.5 minutes. It's super thrashy, it's fun, but it's also really aggressive. It has an absolutely shredding, ripping guitar solo, and then after that it goes into this amazing twin lead guitar section that shows how big of an influence classical music has on heavy metal, and it's fun while also being kind of a little over the top. It's just a perfect metal song. And as I said before, if someone had never heard heavy metal and they wanted to know why it just kicks all sorts of ass, I would just show them Freewheel Burning and be like, hey, here, this is it. And Freewheel Burning isn't the only amazing song on this album. After Freewheel Burning, it goes into Jawbreaker, Rock Hard, Ride Free, The Sentinel, Love Bites, and Eat Me Alive. Those first 6 songs on this album are just banger after banger after banger after banger after banger. And the only reason that the album isn't higher up is because after the barrage of those first 6 songs, you do get the cover of Some Heads Are Gonna Roll, Night Comes Down, Heavy Duty, and Defenders of the Faith, which I feel like the album does kind of lose its momentum with those songs. Just like with Screaming for Vengeance, I think Defenders of the Faith is a quintessential metal album. It's absolutely incredible. The only reason it's not higher up for me is because of those last few songs. Okay, and coming up next is 1986's Turbo, and I'm going to put it down in C tier for me. I love Turbo Lover and Out in the Cold. Reckless and Locked In is good. I don't mind the synths on this album at all, but for me personally, as you may have been able to tell, I tend to like albums that are a bit more introspective and gloomy. So the 1980s sex, drugs, and rock and roll vibe of this album is not one that I really sit well with. Not to say that Judas Priest isn't doing it well, but it's just that I prefer these albums over it. I don't care at all about like, oh my god, Judas Priest is selling out, or, you know, all of that crap. It's fine. I love it when bands experiment and try new things. I just don't think the songs are as good. Unlike with all these albums, British Steel and Sin After Sin, Hellbent for Leather, Defenders of the Faith, and Screaming for Vengeance, if someone said Turbo was their favorite Judas Priest album, I would be a bit surprised, but I'd love to hear like your opinion as to why. Like, I don't hate this album. It's just that it just doesn't leave too much of an impression on me overall. Maybe if I re-listen to it more, I'll have a better opinion of it, but I feel comfortable having all these albums ahead of it. Okay, and coming up next is 1988's Ram It Down. I'm definitely going to put it ahead of Turbo. Ram It Down, the title track, is absolutely incredible. Halford's scream in the beginning, the solos, the aggression of it is just unbelievably badass. I also think that Blood Red Skies is sort of like a spiritual sequel to Beyond the Realms of Death, except in the 80s, so it's even bigger and more bombastic. There's a really great use of synthesizers on that song, and Rob Halford's lyrics about a soldier confronting his death, imminent death, while going up against some sort of technological Skynet Terminator type enemy is really, really both heartfelt and also over the top. And also fun. The drum machine on that album, and on that song in particular, kind of helps to serve the song because it's the enemy, it's something robotic, it's something metallic kind of coming to get you. So, title track and Blood Red Skies, absolutely incredible. Other than that, I mean, there's some good moments on this album. I do love how Rob Halford does not hold back at all with the lyrics to Love You to Death. And I do enjoy Heavy Metal, the song. But other than that, there's just a few songs that are kind of forgettable, like Love Zone, Hard as Iron, Come and Get It. They're not bad. I'm a rocker. They're not bad, but they don't leave too much of an impression on me. And there is also the infamous cover of Johnny Be Good, which there's actually a funny story behind that. I can't remember if it was Halford's autobiography or KK Downing's, but they decided to cover Johnny Be Good because when they were recording Turbo, they were approached by someone about having one of their songs in a movie, and they were like, I don't know, we don't really know about that, and we just kind of want to focus on our songs. And the movie happened to be Top Gun, and it was the biggest movie of 1986, so they really kicked themselves for not having agreed to that. They were like, oh man, imagine how many albums we could have sold if we had just agreed to have the song in the movie. Oh, we lost so much money. So then when they were recording Ram It Down in 1988, someone else approached them about doing a cover of, do a cover of Johnny Be Good so it can be in some movie. I forget what movie. So Judas Priest agreed to that. And that movie just bombed and it wasn't a hit at all. I think that that story is pretty funny because it shows how, like, there's so much that goes on behind the scenes of recording and decisions and, like, actually getting music out there and actually having it be a product you can hear. And there's so many times where bands make decisions that when you're not in the room with them having these discussions, you probably think, like, oh, why the hell would they do that? What made them think that was a good idea? But if we all had been in the room with them, it would have seemed like a good idea at the time. So anyway, their cover of Johnny Be Good is a little misguided. But because of things like that, I'm going to put Ram It Down in C tier, bordering on B tier. Okay, and coming up next is Painkiller, and I'm not going to waste any time. S tier. Painkiller has the best solos that Judas Priest has ever done. It has some of the best riffs. The introduction of Scott Travis really kind of lifts up the band and brings them to another level in terms of technique and aggression. Rob Halford is absolutely killing it. Every single one of these songs kicks ass. I think my personal favorite might be Between the Hammer and the Anvil. It's hard to know. Maybe A Touch of Evil. It's really hard to tell because when you have songs like Hell Patrol, All Guns Blazing, Leather Rebel, Metal Meltdown, Nightcrawler, Touch of Evil, Battle Hymn, and then One Shot at Glory, in addition to the title track, I mean, how do you pick a favorite song out of those? How do you pick a worst song? They're all just so goddamn incredible. Judas Priest, Painkiller, fucking incredible. One of my favorite albums. It's perfect. I have it above Sad Wings of Destiny just because of the intensity, but I still have it below Stained Class because Stained Class is just... It's Stained Class. I love that album. But yeah, Painkiller, S tier. I don't think that should be super controversial. Okay, and coming up next is an album that I have a special category for. That is Jugulator, the first album without Rob Halford on vocals. And this album doesn't sound anything like Judas Priest. And the thing that's funny about it is the aspect of this album that sounds the most like Judas Priest is Tim Owens, who is the new member. This album sounds like some really cool underground death metal band that was inspired by doom metal and grunge and was kind of dipping their toes in the water of progressive metal or industrial metal, all of a sudden met up with Rob Halford or some other power metal singer and made an album. And this album, I'm going to put down into Anything You Say fifth because, I'll be honest, this is an album that I never really gave much thought until, honestly, the last few months. And I re-listened to it again in preparation for this video, and it is fucking incredible. Jugulator is a really incredible album with some heavy riffs, and the fact that all the guitars are down tuned to drop C or to C sharp gives Scott Travis and Ian Hill a chance to shine on this album. Scott Travis, his double bass pedal really does kind of lend itself to more thrash metal and more death metal, and Ian Hill has some super tasty bass fills on this album, and some songs where his bass is super prominent, much more so than on previous albums. Ian Hill, by the way, is a really overlooked bass player, I think. He's not the flashiest, but he's just really rock solid, and if you take him out of Judas Priest, you would be missing so much from the sound. Cathedral Spires is indescribably amazing. And one of my personal favorite songs on Jugulator is Abductors. I mean, holy shit, that song is so heavy. And the reason I'm putting it down in Anything You Say fifth is because it's not just a Dave Chappelle Show reference, which it is, but I feel like it's really difficult to compare Jugulator to any of these albums because it just doesn't seem like Judas Priest. It's like a different band is all of a sudden stepping in. And also, too, I'm afraid that if I put it like up in S tier or A tier, I'd never hear the end of it in the comments, and I just don't feel like I need to listen to this album more, and I need to kind of process it more and compare it to these other albums. It's really difficult, so it's in its own category. I like this album a lot, though. With that, I think that you'll be able to kind of tell what I'm going to do with Demolition. I'm going to put it below Jugulator, but I'm still kind of keeping it away from all these other albums because it doesn't really feel, again, like a Judas Priest album. But I definitely don't like it nearly as much as Jugulator. I still think it's solid, and that these albums get slagged off more than they deserve. The reason that I'm putting it below Jugulator is that it kind of leans a little bit too heavy into the kind of industrial metal sound. Some of the synth guitar pedals and some of the effects they're using, and some things about the production I think are just a little too not to my taste. Also, with these two albums, although they're great, sometimes the lyrics just are not quite as good as what Halford would do. I think, like, an album like Painkiller, Halford is able to take these really over the top and kind of silly subject matters for songs, but he edits his lyrics enough and there's enough poetry in the words he chooses that it works. And, that's not always the case for Jugulator. Manages to be okay, but Demolition has some lines here and there which are a little, maybe you should have redone that, but I still enjoy both these albums. I just can't compare them to Judas Priest, and they don't sound like Judas Priest. They sound like some other cool band that's doing these experimental things. I like Jugulator better than Demolition, but in fact, I really like Jugulator. One last thing I'll say about these two albums is that I feel like Judas Priest managed to take on the 1990s way better than a lot of other legacy bands and bands from their generation. You think of bands like Iron Maiden or Megadeth, Slayer, Metallica. A lot of bands struggled in the 90s with the changing musical landscape. Judas Priest, I think, kind of adapted the best and still made stuff that is a lot more interesting than a lot of the stuff that those other bands put out in the late 90s. I don't know if I'll take some heat from that, but I still stand by it. Coming up next is 2005's Angel of Retribution, the first album where Rob Halford returned to the band, and I'm putting it in B tier, just below British Steel. I finally feel like I'm talking about Judas Priest again, and although I love the detour, this album does feel a lot more like what we know Judas Priest to be. Judas Rising, Deal with the Devil, they're both great songs. I love Hellrider, and I also really love Worth Fighting For. There's only really one song on this album that I don't like very much, and that's the last song, Loch Ness, but it doesn't destroy the album for me. The reason that it's just not above British Steel is because, British Steel is always going to have a soft spot in my heart for being the first album I heard by Judas Priest, and Angel of Retribution, while good, and while a good, comeback album, is the first time that it feels like Judas Priest is sort of looking back on their career and not looking forward. Even with the two Tim Owen albums, they're still trying new things, where this one, they're kind of playing it a little bit safe and giving the people what they want, which is understandable because, Rob Halford had just returned and they're sort of just picking up where they left off with Painkiller to a certain extent. But I am generally the type of person who likes it when a band takes big swings, even if they're a big swing and a miss. And talking about albums that are big swings and potentially a big swing and a miss, 2008's Nostradamus, I'm putting it right in B tier. I know a lot of people want me to put it down at the bottom, but I'm actually going to put it ahead of Angel of Retribution. And I know that there's going to be a lot of people who are about to rag on me and tell me how I have shit music taste and tell me how this album is terrible. But hear me out. I think this album gets way too much hate that it does not deserve. I am a little biased because this was the first album that came out after I had heard who Judas Priest was and after I had become a fan, so I was looking forward to it. And when I first heard it, as, how old was I? 12, 13. When I first heard it, I was a little bit taken aback. I was like, oh, this doesn't sound like Judas Priest. But the more I listened to it, the more I ended up loving it. And the more I found that there were so many nuggets of gold in here. If you want heavy riffs, you have songs like Persecution, Death, Pestilence and Plague, the title track. Future of Mankind is a really good farewell for the band, is pretty much what it seems like they had in mind when they were writing that. For every little bit of cheesiness on this album, there's also sincerity and passion and some really good lyrics. There's a line on this album, "Every man is a child to someone," that really sticks with me. I like the lyrics of Lost Love, and even songs like New Beginnings and Hope, where they're just talking about getting to a better place in your life and just, not letting the bad things you've been through turn you into a cynical asshole. There's also some insane guitar work with the solos, and I enjoy classical music and I enjoy progressive rock and stuff that's more experimental. And Nostradamus definitely is not like an album I would recommend to someone who's trying to get into Judas Priest. I would recommend Angel of Retribution or British Steel, but I'm just glad that they took a chance, you know? Like, they took a lot of chances with Sad Wings of Destiny. They took a lot of chances with Nostradamus. I think it paid off better here, but I really like Nostradamus. Rob Halford in his autobiography says how he stands by every single note on that album, and I agree with him. It's solid. Some cheesiness to it, but come on, you can't tell me that Turbo Lover isn't a little cheesy, or that even like songs like The Sentinel, a little bit cheesy. Okay, so maybe they go a little bit over the top in Nostradamus at times. And I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with me putting Nostradamus up so high, but I stand by it. I would rather a band take a really big risk and maybe it doesn't pay off completely than kind of play it safe, which is why I'm putting it just above Angel of Retribution. And coming up next, we have 2014's Redeemer of Souls, the first album with Richie Faulkner on guitar after the departure of KK Downing. And I'm going to put it at the very, very top of C tier, and I know a lot of you are probably really pissed off that I put Redeemer of Souls beneath Nostradamus, but at least hear me out. Redeemer of Souls is a really solid metal album, and it's really good, and I think that Richie Faulkner brought a lot more life to the band, and it's much heavier than Angel of Retribution or Nostradamus, and I really love that Rob Halford is doing different things with his voice. The kind of death metal growl he has on Halls of Valhalla, Sword of Damocles, and the intimacy of Beginning of the End. The reason that I put Redeemer of Souls down in C tier while I have Nostradamus up in B tier is that I had become a fan of Judas Priest when I was a kid, and Nostradamus was like the new album coming out, and I saw them live in 2009, and when they did all British Steel. And then first Judas Priest announced that they were going to retire and that they were done. And then they said, well, no, we're just retiring from going on world tours. And then KK Downing left. I kind of re-listened to Future of Mankind and listened to the lyrics, and I was like, oh, so this is Judas Priest saying farewell to us. Like, they knew they weren't going to do it for much longer, and this is it. And I kind of made peace with the fact that Judas Priest was going to retire. And so when I heard that Richie Faulkner joined and that Judas Priest was kind of backpedaling a bit, I felt a bit like, conflicted. And so when Redeemer of Souls came out, I kind of remember being a little bit disappointed by it because, like I said, my favorite era of Judas Priest is the 70s generally, and I like when bands take really big risks. And I remember hearing Redeemer of Souls and feeling like they kind of backpedaled a bit musically, like maybe they were a bit caught off guard by how negatively the reception of Nostradamus was. So they were like, okay, well, let's just do a heavy metal album from beginning to end. Now that I've had some space between it, and then I appreciate it more, and I think that this could be an album that I do grow to love, and maybe it goes up to A tier for me if I keep listening, depending on where my musical journey takes me. So I still think Redeemer of Souls is fine. It's just that I prefer all these albums, and I think it's consistent, but I also don't think it's as memorable, honestly. So C tier is still, like, decent. It's still good. Okay, and coming up next is 2018's Firepower, and I'm just putting it up in A tier. You may be surprised because of what I said about Redeemer of Souls, where I feel like Judas Priest kind of backtracked a bit. Because Firepower is like a more straightforward heavy metal album, but they just do it so well on this album that I can't not put it up in A tier. It's difficult for the later Judas Priest albums to be up in the same tier as the classic ones for me, because these classic ones are like, imagine you have a friend who you've been best friends with for 25 years, and then you meet someone new, and you've known them for like 2 or 3 years, and they're a cool guy, but they're not the friend you've known for 25 years, so they're never going to be quite on the same level. But when I try to just look at it objectively, Firepower is just such a great, aggressive, fast, and intense heavy metal album from beginning to end that it's hard for me not to just respect it and be like, yeah, no, it's up here with these others. These later Judas Priest albums, I think I might just respect them more than I actually enjoy listening to them, because these guys are all in their 70s and they're still making absolute balls to the wall, badass, shredding heavy metal on a level that I think surpasses a lot of the other bands that are their same age. And with that being said, I'll have Invincible Shield. I will put it down in the bottom of B tier as the last album. This is an album, again, like I was saying with Firepower, where I heard this album for the first time like 3 months ago. So how can I put it above all these other albums that I've had years and years and years of listening to, and they have you know, a really special place for me. They were just introduced to me at a time where I was really receptive to hearing them. But Invincible Shield is, again, just an album that I'm blown away by the quality of the music and the quality of the performances and just how goddamn good Judas Priest still is after 54 years of being a band. But goddamn, dude, Judas Priest is an absolutely incredible band. And when you have all their albums up and you can look at them, it just, the quality of their output, their worst albums, in my opinion, are Rock and Roller and Point of Entry. And these albums are still fine. They're adequate. I don't know where I'd put these two albums. Like I said, I'm copping out. They're both good, though. They're both great. Look, I already had Nostradamus up in B tier ahead of Redeemer of Souls. Can you imagine if I put Jugulator above, like, Screaming for Vengeance or something? I'd get crucified, but also I don't know if I'd even want to do that. As of right now, though, this is my ranking for their albums, and I hope you had fun sitting back, listening to me ramble on about one of my favorite bands of all time. And if you like this video, if you like this kind of music, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Probably got another video popping up right now that you might like. And thank you so much for watching again, and hope to see you at the next video. Peace.